So I know it's time to do just a quick video when people keep sending me links to other people's videos saying, have you heard about this or have you heard about that? So the latest thing is the idea of a Jubilee year, and that the rapture could be on the Day of Atonement because we're in a Jubilee year, so therefore it wouldn't fall on the Feast of Trumpets. It would fall on the Day of Atonement, and then people have a lot of reasons why they think that the Day of Atonement is a good day for the rapture. It's actually really easy to calculate the year of Jubilee. It's super simple. It's not hard, but we have to think about things a little differently. So I remember when the Lord first sort of got me going on this whole, let's figure out what the book of Revelation says, and let's figure out where we're at in terms of the end times. And I'm just standing there doing dishes, and I hear the voice of the Lord inside of me saying, so, Brenda, what feast day do you think the Lord will return on as far as his second coming? And I'm like, well, I think if there was a feast, it probably would be the Day of Atonement. And then this awareness came to me that if I know the day of the second coming, if it's the Day of Atonement, then I could find out what day the abomination of desolation would take place just by counting backward 1,260 days. Well, that opened up a whole new way of thinking about how to calculate when things are going to happen during the end times. And I know a lot of people are looking back, like at the beginning of time, at certain patriarchs' ages and birthdays, and all kinds of things from the distant past. And really, we're much closer to the end than we are to the beginning. And from God's vantage point, he sees it all. He knows everything. And he's actually recorded the whole end time scenario from beginning to end in his word. So it's actually easier to count backward. And then we actually have confirmation from history about where we're at in terms of time. And we have confirmation that Jesus will return in a Jubilee year, and that it's his second coming that's going to be on a Jubilee, not a rapture. The rapture is not the most important thing, okay? It's the second coming of Christ when he sets up his kingdom, when he's going to rule and reign for 1,000 years. So how do I know that Jesus is going to come on a Jubilee year? Well, that's simple. That's going back to the book of Daniel. So in Daniel chapter 9, we read about the 70 weeks of 7 years. And we have to understand that this language is actually talking about the Jewish sabbatical years. And those sabbatical years always predictably begin on the Feast of Trumpets. And just like our year goes from January 1 to, January of the following year, in the Hebrew calendar, it goes from the Feast of Trumpets to the following Feast of Trumpets. So it's from fall to fall, except for in a Jubilee year. And a Jubilee is 7 groups of 7 years equaling 49 years. And at the end of the 49th year is the blowing of the trumpet, which is sort of what Jubilee means, and the beginning of a Jubilee, which always then falls on the Day of Atonement. So every 49 years, the Jewish year, won't start on the Feast of Trumpets. It'll actually begin on the Day of Atonement. And that's when the Jubilee year is proclaimed. And then people actually go to their regained property over the Feast of Tabernacles, actually on the 8th day. So they would stay in Jerusalem, celebrate the feast, and then go to their newly reacquired properties. And because the year of Jubilee was a reset. It's how God reset the economy in Israel every 49 450 years. There's no real record that they ever actually celebrated the year of Jubilee, but it's, and I think they tried to figure out workarounds because you would lose property then. It would revert back to the original owner. You would lose your, slaves and so on. And there's, they may have celebrated it, but the Jews were kind of notorious for finding workarounds for everything. And debts were to be calculated using the Jubilee year. So, and all that information is in the Old Testament. When we look at Daniel chapter 9, and it's talking about sabbatical years, it's talking about a decree that goes out to rebuild Jerusalem. And that decree went out in 457 BC. And that was in the spring. And then that following fall, 6 months later or so, that would be the beginning of the sabbatical year. And that's when Ezra would begin counting that first group of 7 weeks of years, the first Jubilee, as it were, 49 years. And by the first Jubilee, Jerusalem would be rebuilt. And so we know that from the time of the decree until Messiah the Prince would come, there would be 483 years. And according to the calculations, it means that Messiah the Prince would show up in the fall, over the Feast of Trumpets, over the fall feast in 27 AD. He would die in 31 AD. That's how the Jews would know when Christ's first coming would be. And of course, they were in expectation for the Messiah to come. And so the nation was ready. They were primed. People knew when Messiah would come the first time around. Now, God does not want us to be totally in the dark about, when Jesus is returning. Okay, so the year of Jubilee would be here. This is the second coming. And the year of Jubilee would start right here on the Day of Atonement. And that's when Israel will get her land back. It's when Christ will get the planet back for people to have dominion over it. It's when the beast and the false prophet and all those bad guys are thrown into the lake of fire so that Christ can rule in peace. Okay? This is the year of Jubilee. It's when Christ returns. Okay? It's at the end of the 70th week. All right? So that's the year of Jubilee. Now, if we subtract 3.5 years or 1,260 days from the Day of Atonement, we arrive at the date of the abomination of desolation, which is also the sixth trumpet and the second woe. And all the calculations, for the most part, that are in the book of Revelation are done by counting backward. Okay, because it's easier for us to actually arrive at our dates by counting backward than it is by finding a date in the past somewhere and counting forward. Now, the exception for that is when Israel became a nation, okay, in 1947, 48. And remember, that Hebrew year, that included the UN resolution and the May 14th, 1948 date is all in the same Hebrew year. Okay, we're working with Hebrew years here, not Gregorian calendar years. So that was in the Hebrew year that started in 1947. That's when Israel was regathered. And it's important to understand that the current nation of Israel is not really God's nation. The nation of Israel had to be regathered so that God could bring the Jews back, because the Jews have to be preserved and they're going to be taken into the wilderness, to be preserved in the wilderness until Christ returns. And then that's the foundational group for the new nation of Israel, the real one that Christ wants to have, where he is king and ruler over all. The one that's been gathered right now it has been gathered in unbelief, and it's a secular, not godly country, no matter how much people are pro-Israel. I'm not particularly pro-Israel, but I am pro-God's people, the seed of Abraham, and God knows who they are. Okay, so Israel was regathered in 1947, and this is basically the fig tree prophecy in in Matthew 24 that when you see Israel leaf out, that all the things that we read about in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 are going to take place, and this generation is also going to see the second coming. Okay, 1947, second coming over here. Now, the 80th year for Israel is in 2027. All right. So we have a lower limit right here, and we have the upper limit right here, and there's 80 years in between. And if we take it out to the 81st year, then I suppose we can go to 2028. But 2027 seems to be the best year for the second coming of Christ. So that's when the year of Jubilee would begin. The abomination would be March 30th, April 1st of 2024, which means that our rapture has to be here in 2023. Okay, now here's the deal, is that, you know, people will say, oh, Brenda, you shouldn't be setting dates. Well, I'm not really setting any dates. I'm using dates that exist. This one here, I'm adding 80 years to it, and I get over here. And then what I have is a template. And believe me, everybody who has an eschatology makes a template. This is a kind of a timeline. And a lot of people will have a template that's something like this. Especially if they have a 7-year tribulation, they'll say, we've got 7 years here. Okay, this is 7 years. This is the second coming. This is the abomination of desolation. And this usually is the signing of a peace covenant by the Antichrist. And the rapture is over here somewhere. It could be right here. But this is a template. This is how most people, you know, who are pre-trib, this is how they see it. You know, they'll calculate the 3.5 years over here, and you know, the 1,260 days or 42 months over here, and work their timeline. So what most people have who are dispensational, eschatology, pre-trib, whatever, this is their template. And I actually have one that's a whole lot more thorough, and it's based on working backward from times that are known. So let's say that Jesus doesn't return in 2027, and he returns in 2028. Well, we just plug in new numbers, okay? Because it's a template. It's a guideline. None of the events change, okay? You don't change when the date of the abomination of desolation is just because it didn't, you know, things didn't happen this year. It's all the same. Everything stays the same except you change the dates, okay? And so the template that I have in the description box has provision for a second coming in 2028. So, so if there's no rapture in 2023, we just change the years. So it's not date setting, it's attaching dates to a template, okay? So everything stays the same. I don't change, the feast days or anything like that just because something, doesn't work out in a certain year. Okay, that's not how this works. So if the rapture is this year, 2023, which if we got a second coming in 2027, which seems to be like the best. Okay, that's the best mathematical scenario, especially when you consider that back here in 27 AD is when Jesus showed up. Okay, add 2,000 years, you get to Jesus coming again in 2027. So those numbers work really great. And we have all these sevens here. Okay, and there's actually more. I've done a video where I show all the sevens that show up. It's pretty amazing. If we're raptured this year in 2023, it would be over the Feast of Tabernacles. or Sukkot, not the Day of Atonement. Okay, the Day of Atonement is actually a feast that's associated with Jesus. It's not a harvest festival. Okay, the Day of Atonement actually covers so much of the prophecy concerning Christ, both at his first coming and his second coming. It's not a harvest feast. The Feast of Tabernacles is a harvest festival. Okay, and all harvest feasts where the first fruits are offered are also feasts where people are given the Holy Spirit. Okay, that will be a part of this too. The Holy Spirit will be given, and other things will happen. So if you're interested in finding out what those other things are, you can download my timeline. People also leave comments to me, that I need to stop setting dates. Okay, and I say, well, I'm not setting dates. I'm plugging dates into a template. Okay, and that's different than saying something's going to happen for sure. The thing is the template doesn't change just because something doesn't pan out the way we think it should. All the events occur in a certain order, and that's I think the order that I have them in my template is pretty accurate. I would give it a 90 to 95% that the order of events is going to play out the way that I've sort of laid out there in that timeline. But people will say to me, Brenda, you can't know the day or the hour. You don't know the day or the hour. And I'm like, the day or the hour of what? I don't know what. Because I know this day right here. I know that Christ's second coming is going to be on the Day of Atonement in the Jubilee year. And if I subtract 1,260 days, I can know this date. I know that date and I know this date. And I may not know the exact year for this or for either one of them, but I can know both of these. So I know those. And are there other dates that I can know too? Well, actually, yes, the book of Revelation was given to us so that we would know. So people who plead ignorance or say that you can't know anything, that you can't know because God has said nobody knows the day or the hour. There is one event we don't know. We don't know, but we do know the window for it. Okay, and this is the day of the Lord. When will the day of the Lord begin? Now, the day of the Lord is not the tribulation. The day of the Lord is that 1,000-year day when Christ is going to rule. And that 1,000-year day will actually start prior to Jesus' second coming. The day of the Lord will be here. And Matthew is very clear about that. Abomination of desolation will be standing in the holy place. People will see it. Then there'll be a terrible time of tribulation after, they flee into the wilderness, such as nobody has seen, and it's going to be just awful. And the tribulation of those days will be cut short. That's right here. It's cut short right here. The tribulation of those days is cut short. The sun goes dark. The moon turns to blood. All stuff associated with the sixth seal, for the coming of the Lord. Okay, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then Jesus will come in glory. This is where the tribulation of those days is cut short. The day that we don't know is this one right here. We do not know that date. I don't know that date, but we have a window for it. And then right here is when people are going to be gathered. That's when the gathering will take place that Paul talks about in 2 Thessalonians. Gathering is associated with the coming of the Lord, which is all over here. It's over on this side over here. So the day we don't know the day or the hour is the day of the Lord, the day, that will begin the millennium. Okay, that 1,000-year day. It's called a great day. People ask me, is this year looking good? And I'm going, you know what? This year's looking good. God's in charge. Next year is fine too. But this year is like the best year, as far as I can see, for a rapture right here. And because we do not have 7 years of tribulation, because Jesus fulfilled that first 3.5 years at his first coming, the tribulation for the Jews will not begin until right here at the abomination of desolation. For then there will be great tribulation. And if those days hadn't been cut short, no flesh would survive. The tribulation of those days will be cut short prior to the second coming. That's the events of the sixth seal. Sun going dark, moon turning to blood. All of that is in Matthew 24. It's all in the correct order. Right. And you know, I really don't know why this is so hard. I really don't know why this is so hard to understand, because it's like people glaze over when they read the passage and it's all there in black and white. So anyway, the Jubilee will be at the second coming of Christ. It will be on the Day of Atonement. If we're taken in our rapture over the Feast of Tabernacles this year, and by the way, there has to be a war in Israel before we can go. And it'll be a fast war. It'll be really quick. So we basically have up until kind of the last week of September to have that. So that's still totally possible. So if this year is the year that we're raptured, then the year of Jubilee will begin in the fall of 2027. That's the year of Jubilee. It's the end of the 70th week, Day of Atonement, when Christ returns. All right, so I hope this has been helpful, and I hope I've answered some questions about the true Jubilee, and that the Bible tells us when it is. It's at the end of that 70th Shemitah year at the 10th Jubilee. So leave a comment in the comment section. We'll see you on another video. Till then, have a blessed day.